will be the speakers. New Lair House, we teach the full range of the Jewish tradition and experience. We teach classical courses, Bible, Talmud, and so forth, but we also try to give due attention to contemporary issues that are facing the Jewish community. This event really addresses one of them, namely the whole issue of Jews of color, which has recently been studied. And we have two experts here who are involved in that study. Let me introduce them. We have, as we call him, Bruce of the North, Bruce Haynes, teaches sociology at UC Davis, has been studying this subject for many years. And we have the other Bruce, or Bruce of the South, Bruce Phillips, who teaches at USC and Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, and is one of the leading demographers of American Jewry. So without further introduction, let me hand it over to you, both of you. Thank you so much for doing this and helping educate our community around this issue.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Bruce and I are going to go back and forth. Okay, here's the one we want.
I just want to let everyone know, Bruce Phillips and I, we've known each other for quite some time, but this is a new event for us. And so we're hoping it will all go smoothly, but we're expecting an exciting conversation and sort of hoping to let you guys into conversations that he and I have been having for a number of years now.
Yes, it's very exciting because I have heard Bruce. We brought Bruce to Hebrew Union College and USC a few years ago to speak, and then he spoke over Zoom to a couple of my classes last year. But I've only gotten to ask him questions, so now we actually get to go back and forth. So I realize this is like a sort of, you can take this any way you want, but we've integrated our presentation so that we're going to go back and forth, and we actually spent like an hour or more yesterday sort of going over who's going to say what and what points need to be made. So hopefully we remember which slides are ours. So Bruce, why don't you start?
Sure. Well, when it comes to trying to measure the Jewish community here in the United States, who's doing the counting and who's being counted are two questions that are really important.
Let's start with that one. Did we have one before? Oh yeah, let's start with this one of yours. For some reason it jumped ahead, so.
Well, it has to do with first the distinction between population studies and community studies, and who's doing the estimate. So for instance, if you are a community, communities themselves tend to overestimate their communal populations. And then when you're looking at survey research, depending on the screening questions, you go to the next slide, Bruce. Who's doing the counting is critical, and how they're doing the counting is critical. So if they use a conservative definition, a halakhic definition, and only use matrilineal descent, you'll get much more conservative estimates of the American Jewish population, where if you use self-identification and patrilineal descent and cultural identification, you'll get a much broader estimate of the American Jewish population. And that will have a huge impact on counting both Ashkenazi Jews and other Jews here in the US. And so in thinking about, why are there changes taking place in the American Jewish population? There are a number of things that have been a number of forces that have intersected over the past 30 years that have shaped the demographics of the American Jewish population. So first is the immigration of Jewish populations from the global South. The second is the cross-cultural and cross-racial adoption practices here in the US. There have been lots of Latino children and African-American children raised by Ashkenazi Jews and others in Jewish settings. There's the growth of the multiracial Jewish population since the Loving versus Virginia decision, which finally ended anti-miscegenation laws here in the US. And there's the Ethiopian immigration that took place both in the 1970s and 1990s that brought a lot of attention to the issues of, oh, there are Jews in Africa, so-called Black Jews. There's been a lot of formal conversion. And in fact, Bruce probably knows a little bit more about that. Some of that's taking place down in his neck of the woods. There's been a fair amount of formal conversion of African Americans to all of the different branches of Judaism. So both the Reconstruction and Reform movement, but also to the conservative movement, but more likely to the Orthodox movement. In fact, some of the data suggests the conservative movement itself is shrinking. And lastly, there are Jews returning from Spain who have what we could call Baal Teshuva, those who are returning back to the fold, some from Spain, some from other parts of the Latin-speaking world, and then other folks from the Caribbean world who increasingly we see Afro-Caribbeans making a claim to their Jewish ancestry. So Bruce and I were talking about this. This is really Bruce's bailiwick. Bruce is a demographer and I am a qualitative scholar. So ironically, I'll talk a little bit about some of the surveys and as will Bruce. But when we look back over since the 1990s, that was the first survey that a race question was on a national survey of the American Jewish population. And the scholars who were doing that, many of them were out of CUNY Graduate Center, they weren't really expecting to get a big number. They just thought, well, we need to see who else is there and not just presume everyone is Ashkenazi and quote, white. And they came up with 125,000 individuals who self-identified. That was 2.4% of their sample. They thought that they were picking up a lot of Mizrahi Jews and other North African Jews. And they probably were. And what we now realize is this estimate is probably somewhere in an accurate ballpark because succeeding surveys found very similar numbers. And so, next slide, Bruce. If we jump to 2012, we see that the Cohen Center over at Brandeis University, they used a slightly different definition, came up with a different gross number of American Jews, only 4 million Jews, much lower than many other estimates. And they came up with a sort of lower estimate of people who self-identified as Black non-Hispanic, which is the category that they chose to use. And they came up with 1.6%, which you might on the surface think is not very big. But what happens is when you start adding up the different non-white populations within American Jewish population, the numbers seem to be growing rather consistently.
I'll just add that methodologically, I know that it's an underestimate from just the way that they do those estimates. So.
And okay, so go on to the next slide, Bruce. So more recently, the Pew Research Center, they did a study in 2013. As you see, they came up with 2 million more Jews than the former study, indicating the underestimate Bruce was suggesting. But again, their estimate of people who self-identified as Black and Jewish was around the same number, 1.7%. Now, you might wonder, why am I focusing on just African-American numbers? My research has focused primarily on Jews of African descent in the US. And so I'm using that as a baseline to give us a sense of some of the changes taking place. But we're really going to talk more about more recent surveys that are now grouping non-white Jews together in larger categories that we can call Jews of color. So take it away.
Okay. So I'm very excited to have the new Pew data, and actually I just got it a couple of weeks ago. So you're the first people to ever see any of these data. And originally I got interested in this question because I said to Bruce when he was writing his now very famous book on Jews of African descent in the Americas, I said, oh, I'll just look at the National Jewish Population Survey from 2000 and I'll come up with the number of Black Jews. So about, I don't know, 200 hours later, when I realized that they had included a question on race, but set up the data file in such a way that it was really difficult to work with, only when it came to race. So it was a hard file to work with, which led me to believe it's like they thought, well, we should do something about this, but we really don't care enough about it to spend the extra effort to make it usable. So Bruce.
Well, one of the things, there is the newest survey that came last year from the Pew Center. A few things are interesting about it. First is the shift in methodology. Up until recently, we used to use telephones to get most of our survey research, and telephones were tied to households, and that allowed us to statistically estimate, create statistically accurate estimates. But since we no longer have telephones tied to our homes and we have cell phones and those cell phones move around, it's hard for us to really use cell phones as a basis for sampling people. Because in fact, we didn't really sample people, we were sampling households and then talking to the people within those households. And it's through that control that we used what they called random digit dialing. So with that change led to a change in methods towards sending letters to residential addresses. And that means you need to know where Jews are living ahead of time. And the problem with that method is it's going to target the historic American Jewish population, the Ashkenazi population, but it might miss many, many other less visible Jewish populations in the US because they're not concentrated in the same way that the Ashkenazi community has been historically. And so that methodology it probably creates some limitations to their estimates. So as you see, they came up with 7.5 million Jews, a smaller estimate than the Brandeis survey. And again, they came up with similar sizes of people who identify as non-white and Jewish, but a much smaller number, only 8%. But again, that might be reflective of the method that's focused on residences. But overall, the big shift in the finding of that survey was a shift in the sort of bifurcation of the American Jewish population. The younger generation has moved away from focusing their identity around the Holocaust. And there's been a bifurcation, a sort of secularization of a large segment of the Jewish population, and another component that has headed towards orthodoxy. So there's an interesting kind of split that's taking place that will change the demographics as we move forward into the future.
So it's just a little defense of the Pew study is actually it was a screening to find Jews, but in order to save money, they did oversample areas where Ashkenazi Jews are going to live, like New York City, and they undersampled the West and the South, where Jews are more spread out, and they compensate by weighting. But basically, Bruce is right that it's possible that, you know, they just missed areas where you're more likely to find people of color who are Jewish. So first we have to start with 2 questions. We were trying to think of 4 questions, but we decided we'll stick with 2. Who is a Jew and who is a Jew of color? Now these might seem to be actually straightforward, but they're actually not so straightforward at all.
No, and you know, the scholarship is very broad on the question of Jewish identity. And some scholars have talked about ethnicity as the basis of identity. Others have focused on religion or national identity or even race or terms you've heard, I'm sure, are tribe and people. All of these terms have been used to describe the Jewish population. But historically, ever since Karen Brodkin's work, there's been a conclusion drawn in the literature on the Jewish American identity that Jews have in fact assimilated, no longer experience discrimination and anti-Semitism, and are generally considered to be white. And we're talking about, of course, the Ashkenazi Jews who immigrated in the 1840s and 1880s. And that leaves us with this question: if there's a presumption that Jews are white, how do we make room for Jews who are non-white? So when we talk about who's a Jew, we need to think about the notion that society makes up rules for determining group membership. For race in the United States, we use something called the one-drop rule that has historically defined who is Black. But defining who is Jewish is a much more social question and is very difficult for someone to claim to be Jewish without being recognized by fellow Jews as belonging. And so being Jewish is very much a communal-based identity, as opposed to race, which is an ascriptive identity and imposed upon people.
So for this analysis, we've looked beyond the standard categories for who is Jewish, and I'm going to explain that. But first, Bruce is going to talk about self-definition.
Well, the term Jews of color is a problematic term. And I say that because many people who people might consider to be a non-white Jew or a Jew of color, they may not self-identify as a Jew of color. And so there's a distinction between the category analytically, Jews of color, and do the people in that category self-identify themselves as a Jew of color? And so most of the people in the surveys that have been done don't necessarily self-identify as a Jew of color. So we need to think of it more as an analytical term, or maybe even a political term, as we see non-white Jews beginning to organize themselves as Jews of color. When I say non-white Jews, we're talking Mizrahi Jews, we're talking about North African Jews, we're talking Latino Jews, Asian American Jews, African American Jews. All of these groups might consider themselves a person of color.
So the Jewish categories that are used in the Pew study derive from the screening questions. So households are randomly screened, and then there's a series of questions to get you in. And this is called sampling to find rare populations. In other words, you got to go through a lot of hay in order to find the needle. This is from the Pew study. It's actually in both the 2013 and the 2020. And basically, so if you're Jewish by religion, you're a Jew by religion, you're in. If you say you have no religion and you said you were raised Jewish, and you have no religion, then you're a Jew of no religion, and you're what's called the Jewish population or the net Jewish population. However, if you say you have another religion, if you're a Buddhist, if you're Hindu, or in most cases, if you say you're Christian or Jewish and Christian, then you're classified as people of Jewish background, and they're not included in the Pew report. There's a special chapter devoted to them I'm going to talk about. So, but we are considering this third category, persons of Jewish background. And there's quite a few of them. There's an estimated 2.8 million people of Jewish background, most of whom were classified that way because in answer to the religion question, they gave a religion other than only Judaism. And we're going to talk about them for two reasons. First of all, if we ignore them and we say, well, they're outside the boundaries, then we really don't know as much as we should about American Jewry, because we're looking at the people who fall outside what Bruce referred to as the social definition. Like somebody decided these people are Jews. Most of these people think they're Jews. They said they consider themselves Jewish, but it's been the standard in Jewish demography to say, no, they're not Jewish because they're Christian or part Christian. But that's, in other words, that's the researchers talking, that's not the people talking. And number two, this is from my own research, and actually I did a lot of research on this in Pew 2013 and inspired them to do a chapter at the very, very end where nobody ever gets to it, at the end of, I think it's at page 250 of the report. There's actually very little empirical evidence that persons of Jewish background are not so Jewish. In fact, the Jews of no religion who are Jewish look a lot like the persons of Jewish background. So here's some things from chapter 12. I'm just going to go through them real quickly. So here's the Jews of no religion. 13% said they have a great deal of sense of belonging to the Jewish people. 14% of the Jewish background people. They really look a lot alike. Observed a ritual to mark a Jewish ritual in the past year. 28% of Jews of no religion, 24%. So these guys are Jews. These guys aren't Jews, but they seem to be doing the same things. They're equally, well, actually, people of Jewish background are more likely to say that they want Jewish grandchildren than Jews of no religion. So again, empirically, it's not so clear that, why this group is on the outside and the other group is on the inside, other than the CH word that, they said they were Christian. Of course, there are no questions if they actually believe, in Jesus or what they practice and so on. This is my favorite in there. It's 40% of the Jews of no religion think the US is too supportive toward Israel. And only 24% of people of Jewish background. So basically you're doing like Jewish advocacy on Israel advocacy, I guess depending on what your idea of Israel advocacy is. But if you're AIPAC, these are actually the people you want to talk to more than the Jews of no religion. So there's really just not a lot of empirical evidence that they should be separate. And as we'll see, a lot of, quote, Jews of color actually fall into that category. So here, this is just showing it visually. And this is breaking down the persons of Jewish background. 4% have an Eastern religion. And out of that 4%, I think 3% live in Berkeley. But the largest group is people who say they're Christian by religion. Why do they say they're Christian by religion? Because they have a non-Jewish parent. They were somehow raised as Christian. They know somebody said, "What's your religion?" So they said, "Well, I guess I'm Christian." And by the way, one of the big differences between the 2020 study and the 2013 study, and this is really thanks to advocacy by the Jews of Color Initiative, is that Pew included questions on race for everybody in the household, whereas in 2013, it was only for the respondent. So we really have good data. It just became available a couple of weeks ago. So I jumped right on it. So actually after about, 10 years, I could finally come up with some numbers for Bruce for the revised edition of your book. So the Pew studies, this is how the census asks about non-white. Are you Hispanic? And then what is your race? So there's two separate questions that are combined. As I mentioned, this was asked of everybody in the 2020 study. Here, the Pew questions are a little simpler, but it's basically the same thing. For the respondent, are you Hispanic, Latino? What is your race or origin? How about your spouse? How about other adults in the household? And how about your children? What are they? So we actually have like quite a few combinations, right? We have Hispanic or not Hispanic, and then these four races. And So how are these guys classified in the Pew study, assuming that they were Jewish? They would both be classified as Hispanic for the Pew study. The majority of, well, we won't get too far into the weeds. So that's basically when you're looking at the charts, David Ortiz and Adrian Gonzalez are both on the same team. So clearly, these people are Jews of color. This guy, you should actually check them out. This guy's an author, a lecturer, a rabbi. His stage name is Mani Shtana. And he has lots of interesting YouTube videos. And this is Angela Wernick Buchdal, who's the rabbi of Central Synagogue. She's also on YouTube. I think a lot of her sermons are up there. She's really articulate. She's also a great singer. So she also has a lot of her music. Interesting question. Mizrahi Jews, Bruce raised that earlier. Are they white? They differ from other, quote, Jews of color in that these are immigrants from the Middle East, and they're pretty well organized. They have their own synagogue. So and there must be a dozen Mizrahi synagogues in Los Angeles. On the other hand, in Israel, these are, if you remember from the 70s, the Black Panther Party, actually consciously identified with the Black Panther Party in the US to advocate for civil rights, basically, in recognition of Mizrahi Jews. And if you've seen the HBO series Valley of Tears about the Yom Kippur War, there's a whole subplot about the Black Panthers, and the actor they have in there is actually, they replicated this shirt, and I swear that he looks just like this guy. I don't know if it's a coincidence or if they had this famous poster in mind. Similarly, what about Hispanic Jews? So they are included here as Jews of color, like the census does, but there's all kinds of Hispanic Jews. So for example, would Cuban Jews think of themselves as Jews? We've called them Jews of color, as Bruce raised the question earlier. Bruce of the North raised the question earlier. Would they consider themselves to be Jews of color? Similarly, Jews from Mexico. And of course, they're both Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews from Mexico. I have colleagues from Latin America in Jewish sociology. And interestingly, the older ones find it very humorous that someone would consider them Jews of color. The younger ones who understand, have different reference groups say, no, that does make sense. Pew, in the report, actually says, here, you decide your own categories. And depending on how you define it, it's a much larger proportion. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually just going to use the simple one here, just the Hispanic and race question. But I'm adding a whole other column that does not appear in the Pew study. And actually, this is where a lot of Jews of color are found. So they're made to feel invisible in many settings, and Bruce is going to talk about that at the end. But they're also statistically invisible. They're in the data set, but they're not in the report. So what, Berkeley is, when I think of Berkeley, I always think of my youth and mind expanding drugs. But what we're gonna do today a little bit is what we call mind expanding data. So it's, you're literally gonna have to sort of wrap your mind around the fact that we're now including people who the Pew study said are not Jews, but who told the interviewer they are Jews. And this, in fact, is to get the complete picture of Jews who are not white, who are beyond white and non-Hispanic. We have to look at them. So here actually are some numbers, and I calculated this from my data analysis and the Pew report. In the net Jewish population, that's Jews by religion, Jews of no religion, there's almost half, or just in that narrow definition, there's almost 500,000 people who qualify by even the narrow definition of Jews of color. That's not even including Mizrahi Jews. If we add people of Jewish background, we're up to 1 million people who would be either Hispanic, Black, Asian, mixed race, Native American, and so forth. And I just did this for Bruce because I love Bruce. And like after 12 years, I finally have an answer for you. That again, depending on how it's defined within the normal or the widely accepted definition of who's a Jew, almost 60,000 African American, or as Bruce calls them, Jews of African descent, and add another 1,164,000 people of Jewish background, who again, most of whom think that they're Jewish. So it's somebody else telling them that they're not Jewish. They said that they do consider themselves Jewish. And here you can see it visually. So here it looks like, it's growing, but clearly the majority of a significant minority of American Jewry would be people of color. And here you can see the impact of including people of Jewish background. But it gets even more dramatic when you break it down by age. So within each category, the percentage of people who are Black, Hispanic, other race increases dramatically below the age of 50. So what was 1950? What's 50 years ago? Well, actually, it's when they did the study, it would have been 1970. A couple of years after Loving versus Virginia, when just after the Civil Rights Act, when interracial marriage was increasing in America, and we see it reflected here. So people who were born after 1970, in every category, the percentage of people of color is much higher in under 50 than over 50. And that's Jewish background, Jews of no religion, Jews by religion. And here, again, this is something to wrap our heads around, that when we include people of Jewish background, the percentage non-white increases, because such a large percentage of Black, Hispanic, and other race Jews said they were Christian in some way. That was the main reason they fell into that category. And again, we don't know anything about how they're Christian because there were no questions about that. But importantly, they do say that they are consider themselves Jewish. And as we saw, they're just as Jewish, if not more so, than the Jews of no religion. So here, I broke this down by group, and figured out how to do a 3D chart at this point. And what's an interesting thing that's going on, if you break it down in there, we're well over 200 Black Jews in the survey, so we have a really decent N. We have a lot of Christian Jews. They're the highest proportion Christian. I think that's in the next. No, okay, I'll just tell you. It's a later slide. And there's an interesting book by Samira Mehta called Beyond Chrismica, where she interviewed interfaith couples. And one of the things she found was the African Americans she interviewed talked about having a very strong Christian identity, not because they were evangelicals or believing Christians or even practicing Christians. It's because the Black church is so important in the Black community. So what they were saying was, part of my Black upbringing, part of my Black identity is the Black church. I went every Sunday with my grandmother. Did I like going? No. Did it mean much to me? No. But on the other hand, it meant a lot to my Black grandmother, and she's part of my family, and I'm very close with her. So when you ask me, like, what is my religion? I have to tell you I'm Jewish and Christian, but it's not a theological issue so much as it is a kind of a heritage issue. But anyway, that's why they get knocked out. So in fact, there's actually many more people who are non-white who are part of Jewish families and who had a Jewish parent than comes out in the Pew report. And then there's other places where we have non-Jewish, we have non-white family members. We have non-Jewish spouses of color. We have children of a non-Jewish spouse of color in an interfaith family. So there are kids with parents who might not be Jewish, but are of color. And here, if we sort of look at everybody in the household, so here's all the people who are non-white, a big chunk of them aren't Jewish in any way, meaning they have no Jewish parents, they have no Jewish heritage, they're spouses, and in some cases, roommates. So there is this whole kind of Jew adjacent population. And my wife says to let Bruce talk as well, but this is our sections. So I'm just going to conclude my little section with looking at the children. As you can tell, I'm very excited to finally have some data to work with. And I'm going to quote Yogi Berra. But if we want to see kind of where the future of the Jewish community is, we can look at the children. So here are a couple takeaways. 18% of children in the extended Jewish population that are being raised Jewish in some way are not white. So in other words, you even have people who didn't qualify as Jewish, but their kids qualify as Jewish because they're being raised as Jews. And if we look at the sort of larger Jewish population, which I am arguing that we really need to do, 28% of those children are non-white. So we saw it in the younger people under 50, we really see it among children. And here is, here's how children are being raised. Here are the numbers. You can see there's a lot of them. And if you want to, yeah, I'll print out all these slides and you can send them to you. So here's how they're being raised. This is an interesting chart. It gives, I think, my wife told me to skip ahead. So I looked at, it was quite a bit of programming involved, but I looked at who children live with. So the first category, they live with two parents, both of whom are white non-Hispanic. That's just 64% of all children. Add a white non-Hispanic parent, we get to 3/4 of all children. So in other words, we have 1/4 of all children, Jewish children, living with a parent who is not white. And then I'm just going to conclude with this and hand it over to Bruce. This is there are a few articles that I found looking at mixed race families. And one of the findings was that the race of the child doesn't always correspond with the race of the parent, meaning the parents filling out the census, they tell you what they think the kid is. You can also look at who the parents are to see how what they say the kid is, and like, which do they identify the child as white, as black, Hispanic. So I broke down how children, the race of the two parents. So both spouses are not white. 3% of those kids are not white, identified by the parents. I presume they're adopted. A white non-Hispanic single parent. Most of their kids, they said, were not white. Possibly they're divorced from a person of color, or they adopted a kid. They never got married. They were not able to have children, so they adopted. We know many people who've done that. This is particularly interesting. Neither spouse is white non-Hispanic, but 17% of their kids they identified as white. We need to look more carefully at what's going on there. But I suspect it's possible it's a Hispanic parent who's white Hispanic and said, yeah, my kid is white like me. We don't know. But just to sort of add that whole other layer that the kids don't always correspond to the parents. And in fact, there are children living with white parents, and this didn't come out in the earlier Pew study, who are not white. So I'm going to turn it back to Bruce now to conclude.
Okay, well, Bruce, that was great. Hit the next slide, please. Well, recently, some scholars at Stanford University were contacted to do a study for an organization called the Jews of Color Initiative. And this organization basically used a network of people to create a snowball sample of 1,118 respondents who responded to their survey, a 42-item survey. And they also did in-depth interviews with another 61 people who identified as a Jew of color. Now you'll notice I have Jews of color defined at the very top, and officially these are the categories that they used: Black and African American, Native American, Asian American, Pacific Islander American, Latinx, and or multiracial Americans. So those are the categories that they included. And at the same time, they recognized in a survey that the term is contentious, that not everyone who might be, as I said earlier, who might be classified as a Jew of color necessarily self-identifies as a Jew of color. This is especially true for Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews who may not self-identify as Jews of color, or even Indian Jews, which is also true. And so it's variable whether or not an individual is going to self-identify, and that's going to, of course, influence how this term kind of evolves, because it's a relatively new term. As Bruce mentioned, there are lots of people who are surprised today to find out that they might be considered to be a Jew of color, because that wasn't the framework that they used. Some of this, I do believe, when Bruce mentions the demographic changes towards youth, I do believe this idea of Jews of color is something that is emerging out of the younger generation, for certainly those under 50, whereas those over 50 probably have a different identity. And so this is reflective of a shift in the visibility of Jews of color, but also in their kind of collective frustration in terms of how the experiences that they have had collectively in terms of why they are referring to themselves as Jews of color in the first place. Next slide, please. So just to go over, this is a survey that is not statistically representative, like the Pew survey or the Brandeis survey, which are statistical representative, statistical samples that are reflective of the entire American Jewish population. This, on the other hand, is much more like a large qualitative survey. So we can't really generalize from the Jews of color survey to say, well, this is what all Jews of color look like. It's more that this is the most extensive data ever collected on any group of Jews of color. This is the most we know about them in a sort of statistical way, but it is not generalizable to the broad population of Jews of color across America. With that being said, this sort of biased sample was quite interesting. It was a majority women, 80% had completed college, 40% held professional degrees, 34% identified as having alternative sexual or romantic orientation, 14% were disabled. And just to give a sort of sample of the mix of racial breakdown of the 1,100 people that they had, 400 self-identified as one of more races, 235 people identified as Black, 124 as Latinx, 114 as Asian American, et cetera, et cetera. And so you see this is an interesting group that's not necessarily reflective of the Jews of color. In fact, probably the Asian American and Latinx populations are much larger than the Afro-American population, statistically speaking, but that's not reflected in these numbers. Next slide, please, Bruce. Now, interestingly enough, their attitudes were very much similar to the kinds of data we saw in the Pew study. 63% participate in 2 or more Jewish activities. 23% had a formal Jewish education, which I thought was interesting. And I say 63% participating in two or more activities. Those are activities such as youth groups, JCCs, traveling to Israel, or participating in synagogue or temple life. Most think that being Jewish is a culture, 85% said that. A people, 83% said that. A religion, 73%, or an ethnicity, 48%. Nearly half said their closest friends, or at least half of their closest friends, were Jewish. And 80%, and I think this is probably the number that stands out to me the most, because it's the kind of number that reflects the conversations that were recorded in my research, that 80% had agreed that they experienced some sort of discrimination in Jewish settings. And from my research, when I say discrimination, they mean everything from what you'd think is overt discrimination to someone asking them, how did you become Jewish? Because their color signified that they maybe were not Jewish. And so all of those things might be considered under that experience discrimination category. Okay, I think that's where we should end. One thing I'd love to just follow up with how we presented this data. I think there are two things going on. One is the trends taking place in the broad American Jewish population. And one of those trends is a growing presence of Jews of color. The second piece that Bruce is really making, I think really poignant, is that if we expand our traditional definition of who is Jewish, the numbers of Jews of color go up significantly. And that raises interesting questions about the relationship of those folks to the mainstream Jewish community in the future. Because as Bruce indicates, we don't really have a whole lot of data about them because we conclude they're not Jewish, so we ignore them. And so they're an interesting population that remains to be explored.
And actually, to the credit of the Pew study, they did interview them. In most community studies, like the recent Bay Area study, they get disqualified right off the bat. So they're just knocked out. And again, to reiterate Bruce's point, they actually think they're Jewish. That's why they got interviewed. And then somebody later tells them they're not Jewish, which in a very broad sense also reflects the experience of many of the most Jewishly engaged Jews of color, who, when they get into a Jewish setting, people want to know, are you Ethiopian? Or when did you
Or maybe
convert?
one of those Israelites that you've heard about on the radio.
Yeah, it's right. So we're going to open it now for questions. And I guess maybe the best way to do that is just if you can use the reactions thing. There's a raise your hand, or actually hit any emoji and we'll know you're raising your hand. Sally.
Hi. Hi, Racheli. I didn't see you at the very beginning, so it's good to see you also. I wanted to know, at the very beginning, or initially, you said that many of Jews of color are looking more toward affiliation with the Orthodoxy. And I'm just curious as to why you think that might be happening.
Bruce, you got to, yeah.
I think there are two things going on. One is the broader trend of the Pew study, which indicates the broader Jewish population is moving towards orthodoxy and secularization. But within my research, there was a tendency for people who were converting to take conversion pretty seriously and to lean towards orthodoxy. And I don't think that was too uncommon. But at the same time, I found folks in all of the different traditions. And so I wouldn't say there's a norm there, but if we had the data, and Bruce might be able to speak to this, we might see the same kind of bifurcation amongst Jews of color that's taking place amongst the broader American Jewish population. That I'm not sure about.
Yeah, actually, in part the Orthodox are growing because people are moving out. So most the Orthodox growth is through fertility. They have more kids as opposed to Wale Tshuva. But there is actually something in Bruce's research that is, and I've heard other places that, in a sense, the Orthodox community is more welcoming because it's so behaviorally driven. So should Bruce and I suddenly be hit by a bolt of lightning and decide to become Orthodox, we would really be equal in that, in the sense that we're Baalei Tshuva. Neither of us is from an Orthodox background, and we, be coming in as outsiders. So that's in one way in which that community is actually more welcoming of people who aren't white, because there's so many things to do, and there's so many ways to be involved, that how you look is less important than to make sure you don't have worms in your lettuce, and your sukkah's an inch off the ground.
And in some ways, you could literally say your status as a Jew trumps the meaning of race amongst the Orthodox.
I apologize. I did not say thank you for your talks at the beginning, and I do appreciate what you said tonight. So thank you.
Yeah, there actually is this, I'm trying to remember his name. There's this very interesting rapper who went through that whole process. He was converted. He was from Seattle. He then moved to Israel. He lives
This is Neson Black.
That's it, yes. You want to talk about him for a second?
Well, Neson Black, he's interesting. He has a new Hanukkah song you might want to check out. He's an Orthodox guy who is very Black and is very much from, an American ghetto, and embraces both worlds in a very, very outspoken way. And you'll either love his videos or find them a little kitschy, but he's an interesting character.
So there were a couple of questions. Did anyone use the criteria of halakhically Jewish? You actually can. I mean, Pew set it up that if you really wanted to do that, you could, because they ask about each parent. But I don't know of any social scientists who go by halakhic criteria.
Oh, Bruce, here's an anecdote I learned not too long ago that I haven't mentioned to you yet. So I was at an event a few weeks ago, and I met a young Orthodox Black woman who grew up in Crown Heights. And she told me about how a number of Orthodox Black families left the Crown Heights community because after the riots, they found no place to be.
Wow.
They were wedged between the Black community and the Jewish community, and felt that they had to go. And so it's kind of an indicator of the kinds of struggles that Jews of color face.
Yes, Beverly. You have to unmute.
Thank
There we
you.
go.
Thank both of you, Bruce and Bruce. And I wanted to ask a question, which I see someone else also has in the chat now. And that is, have you worked with the group Bako Lashon? And there's a summer camp for Jewish kids of color near me in Sonoma County. I guess it's mainly so those kids feel very comfortable. And have you worked with that group?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I knew Gary Taubman pretty well before he passed away. I attended some of his think tanks where he organized Black Jews and Jews of color and lesbian Jews and all sorts of Jews he brought together for conversations in San Francisco. And so, yes, that organization has been around, I guess, going on 20 years now. And they were supportive of my work, and we even exchanged some data early in my ventures. So yeah, Gary and Diane Taubman were very supportive.
Yeah, Gary was a good friend and colleague. I have not been involved with Bako Lashon, but I have been involved with Ilana Kaufman, who I know through, actually I kind of know everybody almost, except Diane and Ed, through Dawn Kepler. Big shout out to Dawn. And I did an in-service for them, and actually I volunteered to do another one, because it's because they're the ones who are most involved with research and data at this point.
Gary had something called the Institute for Jewish and Community Research in San Francisco. And so Bako Lashon was Diane Taubman's project that emerged out of that institute. And for those who don't know Gary, Gary was very, very big in opening what he referred to as the gates of the Jewish community. And he wrote a book called Opening the Gates, in fact.
Yeah, and I should add that it's very nice that Gary's being remembered, that he actually made my research on intermarriage possible in the 1990s, because I went back to interview the respondents from the 1990 NJPS, and we were all together on the National Technical Advisory Committee, and Barry Cosman, who was the director, said, you know, there's been a request to re-interview people, but I need to get your input on that. And Gary said, well, who wants to do it? And Barry said, well, Bruce Phillips, I mean, he's a member of our committee. I didn't want to, you know, make it about him. And Gary said, well, it's totally about him. Of course, he can have this data and have the contact information. So yeah, he was a real mention, as Bruce said, very much a forward thinker. And I don't think we should, you know, underestimate the importance of advocacy groups for Jews of color, and really, you know, bringing, you know, making them visible on the communal agenda. Roseanne.
Yeah, thank you both so much for this really interesting talk. But I want to circle back to both your responses to Sally's question. I have found that many Orthodox communities do not accept converts and even other people as Jewish just because they've converted or they are, you know, Jews by birth or whatever. There are these subcategories, FBB, from by birth, you know, you know, newly, like, for want of a better phrase, born again Jews. And I find that certain Orthodox communities and congregations can be very snobby about these subdivisions, and particularly when it's time for matchmaking.
Yes, but the important thing that we were saying is that those are their important categories. So both Bruce and I would be Baalei Tshuva. He'd actually have higher status because he was not, I was raised Reform, so I actually have all this stuff, baggage I have to get rid of. Whereas he's kind of a clean slate coming in, not being raised Jewish. So,
but
yeah,
I think there's a lot of racism. A friend of mine who is Korean was exploring conversion, and she's what probably some studies will call Jewish adjacent. And she found a lot of racism even in conservative circles. And, you know, she was advised not even to convert because Jews are racist, unquote.
I'm a little surprised about that. For me, I have to say, from my experiences, from my research, I think that it's not that you won't find racism amongst the Orthodox. It's more that the rules of being an outsider and being a convert are the things that matter. So I was suggesting, as Bruce says, that her status as a convert would be the problem for her getting married, not necessarily the fact that she was Asian.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's two kind of separate circumstances.
Well, in some ways, you know, you might say Well, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, a lot of that's in the last season or the fourth season of Stiesel, if you've watched that program, it sort of deals with it, but it's because it's a Mizrahi family. So everybody's cheering like, this is the girl for him, she's perfect, but the mom, it's like, they're North African, they're not, European. So it's like, who are these people? And then she says, and then someone says, but yes, your husband, went off the derech for a while. So you have some problems with your lineage. So it's really more about family, yichus and family lineage.
Yeah, and in fact, there's some research on Israel that would suggest that, there's Orientalist orientations that are been adopted within Israel. So, Western Israelis look down on Jews who are coming from, quote, less developed places. And so sort of color and sort of Eastern status sort of conflate a bit. And to what degree that's actually racism as opposed to colorism with other things is where it gets a little questionable. And so different people use different language to describe those things, I think.
Yeah, Roseanne.
Well, my favorite line from Olive Stiesel, which kind of underscores the point of the
You froze up there.
It's when Stiesel, the elder, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, when the elder Stiesel is having dinner at the home of a widow who also happens to be a matchmaker, they're discussing matchmaking for the younger generation. And then the matchmaker starts hinting around that she and Stiesel should move on to the next step. And he says, I've only had dinner here twice. What are you talking about? And she says, Ma nachnu, modern Orthodox? What are we, modern Orthodox? Like it's such a heresy as far as, degree of orthodoxy and what's customary and accepted.
In my research on the Jewish community,
That's not a question.
if there's one thing I learned is that each community creates its own rules about membership. And so a bet din in one Orthodox community might not be accepted in another Orthodox community. That's not uncommon.
And kind of a parallel to this is something that happened really, I think 50 years ago. Lydia Kukoff wrote her book, she created the term Jews by choice, and, discovered as a person who converted that there was all this rejection and prejudice and stuff about people who had converted 50 years ago. It's like, but you're not like us. You weren't born into this. How, if you weren't born Jewish, how can you really be Jewish? And now I think we're seeing a lot of the same dynamics, including advocacy groups saying, hey, this is our experience and we are Jewish. And, and as Bruce pointed out, these are like the most engaged Jews of color, and they're all, I think, I didn't look at the age, but I think a lot of them tend to be younger, which makes sense because many of them are the products of intermarriages that are more recent. And they're the ones saying that, we're getting all kinds of messages that you don't belong, like, what are you? And that Manish Tana has a little YouTube skit where he says, how are you Jewish? And he says, fine, how are you Jewish? And we said, we get all, how is it you're Jewish? Like, both my parents, like, same way you are, both my parents were Jewish. I think he was raised in Chabad, if I recall correctly. Yeah, whereas like no one would ask me, how is it you're Jewish? Or at least just in the synagogue. They might well ask me if they knew other things.
I'd love to tell a story that really surprised me in my research. When I was first trying to, now I've spent 20 years writing my book because I knew nothing about Judaism when I first started writing my book. And so when my wife and when I found myself in interesting spaces, I suddenly decided to go into research mode. And so there was one time we were at a hotel, I forgot what city we were in, and there was some Orthodox wedding taking place in a big event up on a floor above us. And so I snuck away from the party I was with and was just snooping around on the floor. And literally the mother of the bride sees me and approaches me, and I tell her, well, I'm trying to write a book about Jews of African descent, and I'm learning about Judaism. And she says, oh, you're interested in Judaism? Come on inside. And she takes me into the wedding, walks me through, drops me off on the men's side, and says, see you later. And literally, I stood there for 15 minutes, hanging out, wondering, wow, this is, defies everything anybody has ever told me about the Orthodox community. And, after 15 minutes, I decided I better go back downstairs because my wife didn't know where I had disappeared to. And so I've had a couple of experiences like that with the Orthodox, where when I started asking questions, they were more than welcome to answer them and to invite me into their space. But I will also say that I met women who had converted to Orthodoxy who had trouble getting married, African American.
Do you think that was a racial thing, or they didn't have the family yichus, or a little bit of both?
I think it was hard for them to tell, but they did say they enjoyed being in Israel more than being in America, precisely because it didn't matter about color. It only mattered how Jewish they were.
Yeah, a friend, a colleague who's since passed away, his wife had converted. She was like a Midwestern, very waspy looking woman. And they made Aliyah in part because she felt much more comfortable there, because like people didn't say, hey, are you, you don't look Jewish. And in Israel, first of all, she had a wig anyway. So it was like, you chose a blonde wig.
Context matters a lot in that sense. And so I've found myself when I'm in Jewish context that people often increasingly presume that I'm Jewish, which when I first started my research 20 years ago, I was never presumed to be Jewish.
Someone asked, do we have any positive things to say? And I think that's a really good example of, yeah, and I think synagogues, and again, because of advocacy work, the same way it was done on behalf of interfaith couples and of converts to Judaism, Jews by choice, there's, consciousness raising about awareness of greater diversity, and that it's a good thing. We used to carpool to soccer with an African-American kid whose grandmother lived down the block, and he was in her class. So she would drive him to our neighborhood, we'd drive him to soccer practice, and his dad would come from work in the valley. And one day I was after the next brother's up bar mitzvah, our VW van was just filled with all kinds of bar mitzvah chazarai, inflatable shoes and glitter and stuff. And Deontay said, what's all this? And my son Noah, who I guess was about 8, said, Deontay, how can you be Jewish and not know? It's for my brother's bar mitzvah. And he said, what's that? He said, Deontay, how can you be Jewish and not know what a bar mitzvah is? And Deontay was like, no one ever mentioned this to me. He was like really confused because my son just assumed, and I was very, happy that he did so. Like, well, he's friends with us. He lives in the neighborhood. He must therefore be Jewish. Like, somebody's in our synagogue, and I think that's a very, very good thing. I think it will be hard for people. Again, I think it'll be easier for younger people to get used to the idea of Jewish diversity. And if things go well, and a lot of those kids continue to identify as Jewish as adults, we are going to see, easily, 15-20% minimum of young people being, Jewish and and Hispanic, Black, Asian, Native American. Actually, the guy who's the research director for the Orthodox Union, who got his PhD at Stanford in Ari Kelman's program. On his, I think his father's side, his great-grandfather is a native, his father's side are Native American, he's from Oklahoma. And his yichus comes from the fact that his grandfather was a tribal chieftain. And he, I guess, can pull that off more easily as Orthodox because his bona fides there are clear. And at the same time, he's, I think he's the Cherokeeer in Oklahoma, right? Trying to remember.
Bruce, maybe something else is on the table here too. I'm going to be the provocative one. There's a presumption that Jews in America are white. But if we look at the history of Jews in the Western world, that's something that's only been presumed to exist for the past 60 or 70 years. And so maybe the fact of the increasing people of color phenomenon within the Jewish community forces a reevaluation of what it means to be a person of color in the modern world.
Yeah, Don, were you raising your hand? Be sure to unmute.
We still can't hear you, Don.
Don, we can't hear you. Kol Isha.
Bruce, you have a couple of other people with their hands up.
Okay, maybe they're, oh yeah, here it goes.
Robin?
Hi,
Hi, Robin.
how are you? This
Great
is
to
just
see you.
great. I want to tell you this is fascinating. I am very excited about the way that you counted. And I made a point in the chat and I was just hoping, I'm wondering, I can think of people outside of the sociologic community who are going to have a lot of, whose feathers are going to be ruffled by how you counted, even though it matches what I think a lot of us have seen and felt anecdotally, but you have now real data to show this and to explain this in a scientific way. I'm wondering where your pushback is going to come from. And I also have to say I started thinking about this book by Karen Freeman on making and faking kinship, and how I could just see that sometimes we create stories to include in order to create a real community that's meaningful instead of always trying to exclude. And so I just saw it, anyway, she uses it in a very different context in China and Korea, but I just saw it, it jumped into my head. So I want to know who's going to be opposed, because I'm all for.
Yeah, I'm already getting pushback from just, sharing my research informally with colleagues. That's why just look at the data. Tell me. One of my solutions to this is that we should include a question that just, there are actually a lot of Christians in America, a lot of people researching them, and there are various short questions on Christian belief where you could say, I think one of them is like, what do you think of Jesus? If you think he's the Son of God, then you actually are a Christian. If you think he was a good guy, a wonderful teacher, a storybook character, then you're not a quote real Christian. And yeah, I mean, a lot of this I'm with Dawn and I have been doing for the last few years, a study of people who were raised in interfaith homes. And one of the things they talk about, and in this regard, by the way, many Jews of color are going to have a lot in common with non-white Jews of their generation, because they will all have had a non-Jewish parent, or most of them will have had a non-Jewish parent. And they talk about my heritage. So it might be a person who's talking about a Chinese parent. It might be somebody, I mean, we've interviewed people who said, I wish I knew more about the Irish side of my family. That was really sort of like de-emphasized to make sure I was Jewish, but I have all these cousins. And the other side of that is, as a result of interfaith marriage, it's just sort of the impact and familiarity of larger groups of people surrounding Jews. So I was looking, when I get around to looking at Facebook, I saw this great picture of an entirely Catholic family lighting their Hanukkah menorah, and And so the family, the wife is the stepdaughter of my wife's stepsister. So her biological parents are both Catholic. When she was a teenager, his dad married a Jewish woman. So they always came to our house for Hanukkah, for Passover, and they were just included in everything. They moved to New York and they continue observing Jewish holidays because the kids growing up lit the Hanukkah menorah, and they still do it. They also live in, well, actually, they lived in Brooklyn. I guess they live north of the city, but they probably live near other Jews as well. But there is this kind of larger impact. But I think that's something, so the person who has an Asian mother and a white Jewish father will have something in common with somebody whose mother was Lutheran and his father was Jewish, because they both have a dual heritage, and it's part of them, and they're balancing it. We also we live in a time when gender is fluid, your racial communal identity is fluid, and people are getting much more used to the idea of being two things at once rather than just one.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Bruce, I just ordered your book, the other book.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah,
I
it
hope
was
you
the
like
most
it.
popular book in my Blacks and Jews class at USC. I asked them to rate which readings did you like, what should I use, and everybody loved that book. I was afraid they wouldn't understand it, but it's very well written and they really gravitated toward it.
Thank you.
The question from Dawn.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you could speak about the possible correlation between the shift away from especially Ashkenazic identity being bound up with the Holocaust and more openness toward a more diverse Jewish community. I find myself thinking about how, I grew up in the post-Holocaust generation that was, there was so much focus on survivalism in our education, and, that we have to marry a Jew, that we have to have so many, children to replace those that were lost, and always looking back and thinking we've got to replace that population. And I just was wondering, what you thought about that, and if moving farther away from that helps the Jewish community in general to have a more open mind about who is a Jew and the future of the Jewish community.
Well, that's a good question. Actually, my field was critiqued recently by Lila Corwin Berman, who said we're like all patriarchal because we talk about fertility and so forth. What I see happening, and actually where HUC is now doing a strategic plan, is my take is that we're seeing a shift away from being Jewish by religion, largely driven by interfaith marriage, but also by secularization in America. And now is not the time to expand your religious school. But on the other hand, there's this whole group population that a generation or two ago would not identify as Jewish. We have these famous cases, Susan Jacoby from the New York Times, family, grandfather converted, never knew she was Jewish. Madeleine Albright didn't know she was Jewish. I forget his name, was McCaffrey, one of the generals that was in Serbia. He found out as an adult, actually from his cousins who came to visit him when he was speaking in Chicago, said, hey, we're your cousins and you're Jewish, but no one was supposed to tell you because they didn't want to screw up your military career. So now we actually have the opposite phenomenon where people are saying, yeah, I want to maintain this sense of being Jewish. I think kind of some of the rise of white nationalism, which goes along with Christian nationalism. Marshall has made people more conscious of it. Marshall Sclair noted in the 60s that there was a kind of devaluation of WASP culture. These are the people who got us into Vietnam. These are the people who had segregated schools. So there was less desire to assimilate into being WASP identity. And now, as America becomes truly more, multicultural, multiracial, there is not going to be the dominant group anymore. So I do know the Holocausts, people do Holocaust education are worried about the impact, mostly on non-Jews, of not having survivors anymore.
Well, I think there's
about it.
I think there's a cost, a potential cost to the broader society as well. When we look back to the civil rights movement, it was really the religious components of the Black and Jewish communities that came together, right? Heschel and King, and the kind of religious moral basis on which they framed the civil rights movement, I actually think was very important. This generation of young people who I teach are very much divorced from the Holocaust and don't know much about it. And so I think there's a loss there in terms of their understanding, even what those two communities might share between them. And so I think there's a danger of us moving too far away from conversations about the Holocaust that's not just for Blacks or Jews, but for the nation as a whole, particularly in this period of rising racism and anti-Semitism.
Right.
Well, I'd like to thank Bruce Haynes and Bruce Phillips for a very enlightening and substantive discussion on behalf of New Lair House. And I just wanted to finish with an anecdote. I'm not a sociologist or demographer, so I'm going to offer a sample size of one. And that is that when we went to open a bank account at Mechanics Bank for New Lair House, there was a young African-American guy who was a trainee. And so he was watching the process of how, we signed up for a bank account. And he's looking at the description of our organization. And he suddenly says, "Hey, do you teach Hebrew?" And we said, "Well, actually we do." And he said, "Yeah, I'm converting." And we said, not only do we have a lot of courses for you, we have a program on Jews of color. He didn't seem that interested actually in the Jews of color part. So that was also an interesting kind of reaction, but it shows you that our conversation tonight has been very relevant.
I just want to add one thing. I put it in the chat. I'm sorry about the echo. That in our, okay, you do it. Say that Bruce Phillips is going to teach it.
What? I'm not sure what she's trying to say.
Racheli's plugging my lecture in whenever it's in January or February.
January.
We haven't scheduled.
Oh, right. Yeah. We've got another program with Bruce Phillips, actually on the Pew study, focusing on the question of intermarriage. So yeah, thanks a lot for that. Shout out. Keep an eye on our website, newlairhouse.org, for that program and also for many other programs coming after the first of the year.
And thank you for reviving Lair House. It's always been a wonderful thing. And thanks for giving me an opportunity to hang out with my pal for another couple hours.
Indeed, this was really fun.
Thank you so much to both of you. Good night, everybody.
Thanks everyone for your coming.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion.